December 20th, 1941, 11:47 a.m. 7,000 feet above Kunming, Yunnan Province, China. The air was thin and cold, the kind that burned your lungs if you breathed too hard. Beneath the scattered clouds, the city sprawled like a grey smudge against the brown hills. Its streets choked with refugees, its warehouses crammed with American Lend-Lease supplies that had travelled 3,000 miles over the Burma Road. This was the terminus of China's last artery to the outside world, the only route left after the Japanese Navy had sealed every eastern seaport from Guangzhou to Shanghai. For 2 years, Japanese bombers had visited Kunming with methodical cruelty, turning neighborhoods into ash, killing thousands, meeting no resistance. Until today, circling 2,000 feet above the city, in a battered Curtiss P-40B Warhawk, tail number 47, was a man everyone had laughed at 4 months earlier in a Chongqing officers' club. His name was Claire Lee Chennault, a 51-year-old retired captain from the United States Army Air Corps, partially deaf in one ear, chain-smoking Lucky Strikes, and flying with a hearing aid stuffed under his leather flight helmet. He was not supposed to be here. He was not supposed to be in command of 60 American mercenaries who had never flown together. He was not supposed to believe that his ragtag squadron of cast-off fighters could challenge the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, whose pilots had ruled the skies over China since 1937. And he was absolutely not supposed to have designed his entire combat doctrine on the back of a cocktail napkin while a roomful of senior officers mocked him. But Chennault had always been a man who found clarity in rejection. Born in rural Louisiana, raised on stories of Confederate cavalry raids and underdog victories, he had spent 20 years in the Air Corps preaching a heretical gospel, that pursuit fighters, not bombers, would dominate the next war, that speed and firepower could defeat maneuverability, that a slower, heavier plane could kill a faster, lighter one if the pilot understood energy tactics. His superiors called him a crank. They denied him promotions. They reassigned him to backwater bases. In 1937, his hearing nearly gone from years of open cockpit flying, they forced him into early retirement. He was 43, broke, and furious. Then Madame Chiang Kai-shek sent him a telegram. China was dying. Japanese bombers flew with impunity, obliterating cities, factories, railroads, dams. The Chinese Air Force, equipped with obsolete Soviet biplanes, had been slaughtered. Chiang Kai-shek's government, retreating westward into the mountains, was desperate. They needed a miracle worker, someone who could build a fighter force from nothing, someone crazy enough to believe it could be done. Chennault flew to Kunming in May 1937 as a civilian advisor. What he found was carnage. Japanese Mitsubishi G3M bombers struck in broad daylight, flying in perfect formation, escorted by nimble A5M fighters that danced around the clumsy Chinese defenders like wolves around cattle. Chennault watched from the ground, binoculars pressed to his eyes, and saw what no one else did. The Japanese were predictable. They flew the same routes, same altitudes, same formations. They relied on speed and maneuver. They expected no real opposition. He started taking notes, obsessive, technical notes. He clocked their arrival times, measured their approach angles, estimated their climb rates. He studied the A5M fighter, later the famous Zero, and realized it was built for one thing: turning. It could outmaneuver anything in the sky, but it was slow in a dive. It had no armor. Its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. One burst of .50 caliber fire, and it would come apart like wet paper. Chennault wrote it all down in a series of tactical memos that he sent to the Air Corps in Washington. They ignored him, so he stayed in China. And 4 years later, in the summer of 1941, with America still technically neutral but inching toward war, President Franklin Roosevelt signed a secret executive order allowing Chennault to recruit American pilots and ground crew for a covert operation, the first American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. Getting planes was almost as hard as getting pilots. The Air Corps refused to give Chennault anything front line. Instead, they scraped together 100 Curtiss P-40B Tomahawks, planes that had already been rejected by the British and shipped back across the Atlantic. The P-40 was a compromise machine, a pre-war design that had been overtaken by newer fighters. It was heavy, with an Allison V1710 12-cylinder engine that produced 1,040 horsepower at sea level, but wheezed above 15,000 feet because its single-stage supercharger couldn't compress enough air. Its top speed was 345 miles per hour in level flight, respectable but not extraordinary. It climbed slowly, about 2,500 feet per minute at best, which meant it couldn't chase Japanese fighters into the vertical. It turned like a freight train compared to the featherweight Zeros. On paper, it was outmatched, but Chennault saw something no one else did. The P-40 was fast in a dive. It had a roll rate of 360 degrees in less than 2 seconds at high speed, faster than any Japanese fighter. It was built like a tank with armor plate behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits and keep flying. And it was armed. Early models carried 250 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the nose and 430 caliber guns in the wings, but later P-40Es mounted 650 calibers, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. That was 4,800 rounds per minute total, enough to shred an unarmored Zero in a 2-second burst. Chennault looked at this ugly, unloved airplane and saw a weapon. The pilots arrived in Burma in the fall of 1941, 60 men recruited from the Navy, Marines, and Army Air Corps, with promises of $600 a month, 3 times their military pay, plus a $500 bonus for every Japanese plane destroyed. They were mercenaries, adventurers, misfits. Some were top-tier naval aviators, others had been drummed out of service for insubordination. None of them had ever flown the P-40. None had combat experience against the Japanese. And none of them took Chennault seriously at first. He was old, half-deaf, a washed-up has-been with a thick Louisiana drawl and a paranoid obsession with altitude advantage. When he gathered them in a sweltering Toungoo classroom on September 8, 1941, and began lecturing about energy tactics, several pilots laughed out loud. Chennault didn't get angry. He walked to the blackboard and drew a diagram. 2 planes, one light and maneuverable, one heavy and fast. The light plane tries to turn inside the heavy plane. The heavy plane refuses the turn. Instead, it dives, building speed, then zooms back up, converting velocity into altitude. The light plane tries to follow but bleeds energy in the climb. The heavy plane levels out, rolls inverted and dives again, this time from above, guns blazing. And the light plane has no answer because it's slow and exposed, and the heavy plane is gone before it can react. Chennault called it boom and zoom. He had been teaching it since 1935. The Air Corps had called it cowardice and abandonment of the honorable dogfight, but Chennault called it physics. He told his pilots 3 rules: never dogfight a Zero, never climb after a Zero, never try to follow a Zero in a turn. Instead, attack from altitude, dive at full throttle, fire a short burst, keep diving, use your speed to escape, then climb back up, out of range, and set up another attack. If you don't have altitude, don't engage. If you don't have speed, run. The Zero has 200 horsepower less than you, no armor, and paper-thin skin. You have 650 calibers and a 2,000-pound weight advantage. You can outrun him in a straight line, and you can outdive him every time. He has to get close to kill you. You can kill him from 400 yards. Patience wins, discipline wins, altitude wins. Some pilots understood immediately. Others thought he was insane. One Navy lieutenant named David Tex Hill, who would later become an ace, stood up in the middle of the briefing and said, "Sir, respectfully, that's not how fighter pilots fight." Chennault stared at him for a long moment, then replied, "Son, if you fight the way you were taught, you'll be dead in a week. I'm teaching you how to kill them and go home." The room went silent. Hill sat down. For 3 months, Chennault drilled them relentlessly. Mock dogfights, altitude drills, gunnery runs. He made them practice high-speed dives until their hands shook. He made them attack in pairs, one plane firing, the other covering, never alone. He made them memorize the silhouette of every Japanese plane, the Zero's rounded wingtips, the Ki-27 Nate's fixed landing gear, the Ki-43 Oscar's inline canopy. He stood on the runway with a stopwatch and timed their reaction scrambles, screaming at pilots who took more than 3 minutes to get airborne. He worked them until they hated him. And then, On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Overnight, Chennault's mercenaries became the only American fighter unit actively engaging the enemy. On December 18th, the 1st American volunteer group flew its first combat mission, escorting RAF bombers over Thailand. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence confirmed a major raid on Kunming. 10 Kawasaki Ki-48 twin-engine bombers, escorted by 25 Ki-27 Nate fighters, were inbound from Hanoi. The bombers carried 100-pound payloads. The city had no air raid shelters. If they reached the target, thousands would die. Chennault was in his operations shack when the early warning net called it in. China had no radar, but Chennault had built a system almost as effective, a network of spotters, farmers, missionaries, school teachers, scattered across 500 miles of countryside, each equipped with a telephone or radio and a recognition chart. They tracked Japanese formations from the moment they crossed the border, relaying altitude, heading, and aircraft count. Chennault could plot an enemy raid in real time and scramble his fighters with 15 minutes warning. It was primitive, but brilliant. A low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. That morning, the net crackled to life at 11:20 a.m. Bombers inbound. Altitude, 18,000 feet. Estimated arrival, noon. Chennault grabbed the phone and called his alert flight. 4 P-40Bs from the 2nd Squadron, Hell's Angels. His orders were simple. Get to 20,000 feet over Kunming. Stay there. Wait for my signal. Do not engage the escorts. Hit the bombers from above. One pass, full throttle, then dive away. If you get separated, head for the deck and run, understood? Yes, sir. The pilots ran to their planes. At 11:38 a.m., 4 Curtiss P-40B Warhawks clawed into the sky from Kunming's dirt airstrip. Their Allison engines screaming, their shark-mouthed nose art grinning in the sunlight. Leading the flight was Robert Duke Hedman, a former Navy pilot from South Dakota, 26 years old, cool under pressure. On his wing was Fritz Wolf, a Navy dive bomber pilot who had switched to fighters, older than most at 32. The second element was Jim Howard, a Navy fighter pilot from Missouri, and Ed Rector, a Marine aviator from North Carolina who would later become one of the AVG's top aces. None of them had ever fired their guns in anger. None had ever seen a Japanese bomber. And all of them, climbing through thin mountain air toward the killing zone, were thinking about the Napkin. Chennault had shown it to them weeks earlier, half as a joke. It was a bar napkin from the Chongqing Officers Club, stained with whiskey and covered in his cramped handwriting. On it, he had sketched his entire tactical system: altitude advantage, slashing attacks, energy conservation, mutual support. At the time, a British liaison officer had seen it and laughed, saying, "You expect to fight the Japanese Air Force with a napkin?" Chennault had folded it carefully, put it in his pocket, and replied, "I expect to beat them with it." Now, climbing through 15,000 feet, Duke Hedman remembered that napkin. He remembered the diagrams, the angles, the drill: don't chase, don't turn, dive and extend. He checked his altimeter, 18,000 feet. He called the flight, "Steady climb. We're going to 20,000. At 11:52 a.m., they leveled off. The city was a distant smudge below. The air was so thin that Hedman could hear his own heartbeat over the engine noise. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. Then, at 12 o'clock high, a glint of metal. He keyed the radio. Bandits. High. 12 o'clock. Bombers in formation. The Ki-48s were flying in a tight V, crisp and professional, 17,000 feet and climbing. The escorts, Ki-27 Nates, were weaving above them, 25 silver dots against the blue. Hedman counted quickly. They were outnumbered 6-1. He thought about the napkin, about Chennault's rules, about the drilling. He pulled the stick back, climbed another 500 feet, and positioned the flight up-sun. Then he rolled inverted, pointed his nose at the lead bomber, and spoke 4 words into the radio. "Going in. Follow me." The dive was vertical, engine howling, airspeed building past 350, then 400 miles per hour. The bomber grew in his gun sight, grey-green camouflage, red Hinomaru circles on the wings. He could see the dorsal gunner swiveling his weapon, could see the tracer fire arcing toward him, slow and lazy at this speed. He ignored it. At 600 yards, he pressed the trigger. The nose guns roared, the wing guns hammered, and the P-40 shook like it was tearing itself apart. 50 caliber rounds walked up the bomber's fuselage, punching through aluminum skin, shattering glass, tearing into fuel tanks. The bomber staggered, smoke pouring from its port engine. Hedman kept firing until he was 300 yards out, then shoved the stick forward and dove through the formation, so fast the Japanese escorts couldn't react. Behind him, Fritz Wolf, Jim Howard, and Ed Rector followed the same playbook. Wolf's burst hit the second bomber in the wing root, igniting fuel. Howard stitched the third bomber from nose to tail, killing the pilot instantly. Rector's guns jammed after 2 seconds, but his momentum carried him through. All 4 P-40s blew past the bomber formation at over 400 miles per hour, dove another 5,000 feet, then pulled out hard and climbed back toward the sun. The entire attack lasted 9 seconds. The Japanese pilots, trained for slow-turning dogfights with obsolete Chinese biplanes, had never seen anything like it. 3 bombers were falling. One was trailing fire, spinning into the mountains. Another had lost its tail. The third was in a flat spin, trailing debris. The remaining bombers broke formation, jettisoned their payloads early, and turned for home. The escorts, confused and disorganized, tried to pursue the P-40s but couldn't catch them in the climb. Hedman led his flight back to 20,000 feet, checked his fuel, checked his wingman, and keyed the radio. "Bandits breaking off. We're clear." Below, Kunming was untouched. The bombs had fallen in empty rice paddies 10 miles short of the city. When they landed 20 minutes later, Chanol was waiting on the runway, stopwatch in hand, napkin in his pocket. He didn't smile. He just nodded. 4 planes, 4 rookies, first combat mission. 3 confirmed kills, 1 probable, 0 losses. The tactics worked. The napkin worked. And somewhere in a Chongqing officers' club, a British liaison officer was reading the intelligence report and realizing that he had been very, very wrong. The Japanese did not take the humiliation well. Within 48 hours of the Kunming raid, Imperial Army Air Force headquarters in Hanoi was receiving furious cables from Tokyo demanding explanations. How had 3 bombers been destroyed by an unknown enemy? Who were these pilots? What kind of aircraft were they flying? Intelligence officers scrambled for answers. Reconnaissance photos showed American-made fighters with shark-mouth nose art parked on Kunming's airstrip. Radio intercepts captured English-language chatter on Chinese frequencies. Within a week, Japanese intelligence had identified Chanol's operation. American mercenaries, flying obsolete P-40 Tomahawks, led by a retired officer who had been forced out of his own air force. The assessment from Tokyo was swift and dismissive. These were not elite pilots. They were rejects, washouts, criminals flying museum pieces. The initial defeat was a fluke, a matter of surprise. It would not happen again. But it did. On December 23, 1941, the Japanese launched a second raid on Kunming. 12 Ki-48 bombers, 30 Ki-27 Nate fighters, approaching from the southwest at 19,000 feet. Chanol's early warning net picked them up 60 miles out. He scrambled 8 P-40s from the 2nd Squadron. The Americans climbed to 22,000 feet, positioned themselves up-sun, and waited. When the Japanese formation passed beneath them, the P-40s rolled inverted and dove in pairs, hitting the bombers from above and behind in coordinated slashing attacks. The Japanese escorts tried to intercept, but the P-40s were moving too fast, diving through the formation at over 400 miles per hour, firing 2-second bursts, then pulling out and climbing back to altitude before the Nates could react. 4 bombers went down. The rest jettisoned their loads and fled. The P-40s returned to base without a scratch. It happened again on December 25th, Christmas Day. The Japanese sent 18 bombers and 40 fighters. Chanol put 12 P-40s in the air. The Americans shot down 6 bombers and 3 fighters. 1 P-40 took hits in the wing, but made it home. The pilot, a former Marine named Gregory Boyington, who would later become infamous as Pappy Boyington of the Black Sheep Squadron, landed with 57 bullet holes in his plane and a cigarette clenched between his teeth. He told Chanol the tactics worked, but the odds were getting worse. The Japanese were learning. They were flying higher, tighter formations, keeping their escorts closer to the bombers. They were adapting. Chennault knew what was coming. The Japanese had lost 14 bombers and 4 fighters in 1 week. Their pride was wounded. Their doctrine was in question. They would escalate, and they would send their best. On January 3, 1942, Japanese intelligence confirmed that the 64th Sentai, one of the most elite fighter units in the Imperial Army Air Force, was being redeployed from Indochina to Hanoi with orders to destroy the American volunteer group. The 64th Sentai flew the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, codenamed Oscar by the Allies. It was newer, faster, and deadlier than the Ki-27. With a top speed of 308 miles per hour and a climb rate of 3,900 feet per minute, it could reach altitude faster than the P-40. Its armament was light, just 2 12.7mm machine guns, but it retained the legendary Japanese maneuverability. In the hands of an experienced pilot, the Oscar could turn inside anything the Americans had. Leading the 64th Sentai was Captain Kenji Shimada, a veteran of the China campaign with 11 confirmed kills. Shimada was not a glory seeker. He was a tactician, methodical and patient. He studied the reports from Kunming and identified the American weakness. The P-40 pilots refused to dogfight. They attacked from above, dove through, and ran. They never stayed to engage. Shimada saw this as cowardice but also as predictability. If the Americans always attacked from altitude, then the solution was to deny them altitude. He devised a new formation. Bombers at 16,000 feet, a close escort of 12 Oscars at 17,000 feet, and a top cover of 12 more Oscars at 20,000 feet, weaving in a figure-8 pattern to cover the sky above. If the Americans dove from above, they would hit the top cover first. If they tried to hit the bombers, the close escort would be waiting, and if they hesitated, the bombers would reach their target. It was a trap. On January 6, 1942, Shimada led 20 Ki-48 bombers and 24 Ki-43 Oscars toward Kunming. The formation crossed the border at 9:40 a.m. Chennault's warning net reported them at 9:52. He scrambled 16 P-40s, the largest force he had ever put in the air at once. The Americans climbed hard, clawing for altitude, engines straining in the thin mountain air. By 10:10 they were at 21,000 feet, circling over Kunming, waiting for the Japanese. Then someone spotted them. A massive formation, stepped up in layers, the bombers low, the escorts high, the whole armada glittering in the sunlight like a steel cloud. The Americans had altitude, but just barely, and for the first time, the Japanese were ready. Duke Hedman, leading the 1st Squadron element, saw the trap immediately. The top cover was weaving at 20,000 feet, right where the P-40s would normally dive from. If they attacked the bombers, they would have to go through the escorts first. If they engaged the escorts, the bombers would get through. Hedman keyed the radio and called Chennault, who was orbiting 5 miles away in a command plane, watching the battle unfold. Flight leader to base, they're stacked. Recommend we split. Half on the bombers, half on the top cover. Chennault's voice crackled back, calm and flat. Negative. Hit the bombers. Ignore the escorts. Dive, shoot, extend. Do not engage. Hedman swallowed hard. Chennault was asking them to dive into a hornet's nest, take their shot and run, trusting that speed and surprise would carry them through. It was the Napkin doctrine, scaled up to a knife fight. Hedman checked his fuel, checked his wingman, and rolled inverted. 1st Squadron on me, going in. 16 P-40s nosed over and dove, engines howling, airspeed building past 350, then 400 miles per hour. The Japanese top cover reacted instantly. 12 Oscars broke formation and dove to intercept, their pilots pulling negative Gs, instruments rattling, trying to cut off the Americans before they reached the bombers. What happened next was chaos. The P-40s hit the bomber formation like a freight train, guns blazing, 50 caliber tracers ripping through aluminum and flesh. 2 bombers exploded in mid-air. A third lost a wing and tumbled out of formation. But the Oscars were on them now, diving in from above. Machine guns chattering, rounds pinging off armor plate and punching through canopies. 1 P-40, flown by a pilot named Louis Hoffman, took hits in the engine cowling and began trailing smoke. Another, piloted by Jim Howard, had his windscreen shattered by a 12.7mm round that passed 6 inches from his head. The Americans kept diving, kept firing, kept accelerating. At 12,000 feet they pulled out hard, 4 Gs crushing them into their seats, and leveled off at full throttle, heading east at 420 miles per hour. The Oscars tried to follow, but at that speed they were maxed out. Their lighter airframes and lower-powered engines couldn't keep pace. The P-40s extended away, opening the gap to 2 miles, then 3. The Japanese pilots, frustrated and low on fuel, broke off and climbed back to rejoin the formation. But the damage was done. 4 bombers were down. The rest were scattered, their tight formation shattered. The close escort, which had been positioned to defend against a prolonged engagement, had never fired a shot because the Americans had blown through too fast. Shimada, watching from his cockpit, realized with cold clarity that the reports had been wrong. These were not cowards. They were disciplined, professional killers who understood energy tactics better than anyone he had ever fought. But the battle was not over. The P-40s had expended most of their ammunition and burned through a third of their fuel. They needed to climb back to altitude to re-engage, but climbing was slow and the Japanese were already repositioning. Chennault, watching from his command plane, saw the problem. The bombers were regrouping and pushing toward Kunming. If the P-40s climbed to attack again, they would be low on fuel and ammunition, vulnerable to the escorts. If they disengaged and landed, the bombers would get through. It was the nightmare scenario Chennault had drilled for, but hoped never to face. He made the call. All flights, disengage and return to base. Repeat, disengage and return to base. Duke Hedman, already banking to climb, hesitated. The bombers were 5 miles away, heading straight for the city. He could see the residential districts below, the markets, the hospitals. He could see the refugees crowding the streets. He keyed the radio. "Base, we can get one more pass." Chennault's reply was immediate and sharp. "Negative. You're low on fuel and ammo. If you engage now, you'll be dead or on the ground when the next raid comes. Land, rearm, refuel, that's an order." Hedman's jaw tightened. He hated it, but he knew Chennault was right. He banked east and called the squadron. "All flights RTB. We're done." The P-40s landed at 10:34 a.m., engines smoking, fuel gauges near empty. The ground crews swarmed the planes, reloading ammunition belts, hauling fuel drums, patching bullet holes with canvas and glue. The pilots climbed out, drenched in sweat, hands shaking from adrenaline. Louis Hoffman's engine was ruined, 3 cylinders punched through by Oscar fire. Jim Howard's windscreen was gone, his face cut by glass shards. But they were alive. And 30 minutes later, when the Japanese bombers reached Kunming, they dropped their payloads from 18,000 feet, too high for accuracy, too rattled to press the attack. The bombs fell in empty fields and river valleys. The city was untouched. Shimada landed in Hanoi 3 hours later, furious and bewildered. His pilots had engaged an inferior enemy flying inferior planes. They had outnumbered them 2-1. They had set a perfect trap. And they had still lost 4 bombers without inflicting a single confirmed kill. In his after-action report, Shimada wrote, "The American pilots refuse to fight honorably. They attack from extreme altitude, dive at excessive speed, and withdraw before engagement. Their aircraft are heavily armored and difficult to destroy. Recommend we increase escort strength and altitude ceiling to counter their tactics." Tokyo approved. The next raid would be bigger. Over the next 3 weeks, the Japanese escalated relentlessly. Raid after raid, each one larger, each one more determined. January 10th, 24 bombers, 36 fighters. January 15th, 30 bombers, 45 fighters. January 20th, 36 bombers, 50 fighters. Chennault's pilots flew multiple sorties per day, sometimes 3 or 4, landing only to rearm and refuel before scrambling again. They were exhausted, running on coffee and cigarettes, nerves frayed to the breaking point. Planes that took damage one day were patched overnight and flown the next. Engines were run past their rated hours, guns jammed from overuse, and the losses started to mount. On January 12th, a P-40 flown by Henry Gilbert was hit by Oscar fire during a diving attack. The rounds punched through his oil cooler, and the engine seized at 8,000 feet. Gilbert bailed out, landed in a rice paddy and walked back to base 3 days later with help from Chinese villagers. On January 18th, another P-40, piloted by Gil Bright, collided with a Ki-48 bomber during a head-on attack. Both planes disintegrated. Bright's body was never recovered. The Japanese were learning, adapting, tightening their formations, improving their coordination. And Chennault's doctrine, brilliant as it was, had a fatal flaw. It required altitude advantage. If the Japanese could deny that advantage, the P-40s would be forced into turning fights they couldn't win. Shimada saw the opening. On January 23rd, he devised a new tactic, a feint. He would send a small formation of bombers at low altitude, 12,000 feet, escorted by a token force of fighters. The Americans, seeing an easy target, would dive to attack. But waiting above, invisible at 24,000 feet, would be a squadron of Oscars with orders to pounce the moment the P-40s committed. It was a bait-and-switch, a reversal of Chennault's own tactics. Shimada called it the ambush from heaven. On January 24, 1942, the trap was set. 6 Ki-48 bombers and 8 Ki-43 Oscars crossed the border at 12,000 feet, flying slowly, almost lazily, toward Kunming. Chennault's warning net reported them at 11:15 a.m. He scrambled 8 P-40s from the 3rd Squadron, Hell's Angels. The Americans climbed to 18,000 feet, saw the low-flying Japanese formation, and assumed it was a mistake. The squadron leader, a former Navy pilot named Robert Prescott, radioed Chennault. "Base bandits are at 12,000. We've got 6,000 feet on them. Permission to engage." Chennault, suspicious, hesitated. The Japanese had never flown that low before. It didn't make sense. He scanned the sky through his binoculars but saw nothing. Finally he replied, "Engage but stay fast. 1 pass and out." Prescott rolled inverted and dove. The 7 other P-40s followed. They came screaming down from 18,000 feet, airspeed building past 400, guns armed, targeting the lead bomber. At 14,000 feet, Prescott saw it, a glint of sunlight on metal, high above, almost directly overhead. He shouted into the radio, "Break, break, high cover, 12 o'clock high." But it was too late. 16 Ki-43 Oscars, diving from 24,000 feet at full throttle, slammed into the P-40 formation like a hammer. The Americans scattered, abandoning their attack, pulling into desperate evasive maneuvers. The Oscars, faster in the dive than anyone expected, stayed with them, firing long bursts, their 12. 7mm rounds sparking off armor plate and tearing into control surfaces. 2 P-40s were hit immediately. One, flown by a pilot named Kenneth Jernstedt, took rounds in the tail and lost elevator control. He fought the stick, managed to stabilize, and dove for the deck, the only escape. Another P-40, piloted by Charles Older, had his right aileron shot away. The plane rolled violently to the right, and Older, yanking the stick left with both hands, barely kept it level. The rest of the squadron dove, scattered, and ran, each pilot fighting alone, the carefully drilled teamwork shattered by surprise and speed. It was the nightmare Chennault had warned them about, caught low, caught slow, forced to dogfight. And for the first time since Kunming, the Japanese had the advantage. Prescott, diving at full throttle, glanced in his mirror and saw an Oscar closing from 6 o'clock, tracers walking toward his tail. He shoved the stick forward, dove steeper, pulled the throttle past the red line, and watched his airspeed hit 450 miles per hour. The Oscar, lighter and less structurally sound, couldn't follow without risking the wings tearing off. It broke off at 8,000 feet. Prescott leveled out alone 10 miles east of Kunming, heart hammering, hands shaking. He keyed the radio. "Squadron, rally at base. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." One by one, the surviving P-40s called in. 7 had made it out. 1, Charles Older's plane, was crippled but flying. The 8th, Kenneth Jernstedt, had belly-landed in a river valley. He survived, but his plane was a total loss. Chennault, watching from the ground, knew immediately what had happened. He had been outthought. The Japanese had turned his own doctrine against him, using altitude advantage and surprise to force the Americans into a bad fight. It was brilliant, and it was terrifying. If Shimada could replicate this tactic, the P-40s would be finished. That night, Chanol called his pilots together in a cramped briefing room lit by kerosene lamps. He looked exhausted, his face lined and grey. He didn't apologize, he didn't sugarcoat. He said, "They're learning faster than I expected. From now on, no engagements below 20,000 feet. If you don't have altitude, you don't engage. If it looks like a trap, it is a trap. Discipline wins, patience wins. If we fight their fight, we lose." The pilots nodded, silent, grim. They had seen what happened when the rules broke down. They would not let it happen again. For 3 days after the ambush, the Japanese did not come. The skies over Kunming were empty, the silence more unnerving than the sound of air raid sirens. Chanot used the time to regroup. He rotated exhausted pilots out of combat rotation, brought in reserves from the 3rd Squadron, and personally inspected every P-40 on the flight line, checking engines, control surfaces, ammunition loads. He knew what the silence meant. The Japanese were planning something big. And on the morning of January 28, 1942, his intuition was confirmed. The early warning net crackled to life at 10:05 a.m. with a report that made everyone in the operations shack go still. 70-plus aircraft inbound from Hanoi, altitude 22,000 feet, bearing directly for Kunming. It was the largest raid yet. Chanot looked at the plot board, counted his available fighters, 18 P-40s, half of them with engine problems or battle damage, and made a decision that would either validate everything he had built or destroy it. He would commit every flyable plane. No reserves, no second wave, everything. If the Japanese broke through, Kunming would burn. If the P-40s won, the Japanese would learn that numbers alone could not defeat discipline and doctrine. Chanot walked out to the flight line, gathered his pilots, and gave the briefest briefing of his career. He said, 70 of them, 18 of us, you know the rules, altitude, speed, discipline, stay in pairs. One pass, full throttle, extend. If you get separated, dive for the deck and run home. Do not chase. Do not dogfight. Kill them and leave." He paused, looked each pilot in the eye and added, "This is what we trained for. Show them what the Napkin can do." At 10:22 a.m., 18 Curtiss P-40B and P-40E Warhawks lifted off from Kunming in 3 flights of 6, engines roaring, shark mouths grinning. Leading the first flight was Duke Hedman, now a seasoned combat veteran with 5 confirmed kills. The second flight was led by Robert Prescott, still haunted by the ambush 3 days earlier, determined not to be caught again. The third flight was commanded by John Newkirk, a former Navy pilot known for his ice-cold nerves and precision gunnery. They climbed hard, clawing for altitude, pushing the Allison engines to their limits. At 15,000 feet, the superchargers were gasping. At 18,000 feet, the rate of climb dropped to 1,500 feet per minute. At 20,000 feet, it was down to 800 feet per minute, the engines starving for oxygen, the pilots breathing hard through their masks. But they kept climbing. At 10:47 a.m., they leveled off at 24,000 feet, the highest they had ever flown operationally, and waited. 5 minutes later, the Japanese formation appeared on the horizon like a swarm of locusts. 40 Ki-48 bombers, in 4 perfect V formations, stepped up from 20,000 to 22,000 feet. Escorting them were 30 Ki-43 Oscars, split into 3 groups, 10 on close escort at 21,000 feet, 10 on high cover at 23,000 feet, and 10 more weaving in a combat air patrol pattern 2 miles ahead of the bombers. It was the most sophisticated defensive formation the Japanese had ever flown over China, designed to counter every tactic Chanot had used. But Shimada, leading the escort from his cockpit, had made one miscalculation. He had assumed the P-40s could not climb above 22,000 feet with a full combat load. He was wrong by 2,000 feet. Hedman saw them first. The entire formation spread out below, like a 3-dimensional chessboard. He keyed the radio and called Chanot, who was orbiting 10 miles south in a patched-up P-40, acting as airborne command. "Flight leader to base. We're at 24,000. Bandits at 22. We have the altitude." Chanot's voice came back, crackling through the static. "Roger, execute. Hit the bombers. Speed is life." Hedman acknowledged, checked his fuel, 30 minutes of combat time, and issued orders to the 3 flights. First flight would hit the lead bomber formation from above. Second flight would engage 30 seconds later, targeting the middle formation. Third flight would hold high and cover against the top escort. Staggered attacks, mutual support, the Napkin doctrine scaled to a battle. At 10:54 a.m., Headman rolled inverted, pointed his nose at the lead bomber formation, and spoke one word into the radio. Go. 6 P-40s nosed over and dove, wings singing in the thin air. Airspeed building past 350, then 400, then 420 miles per hour. The Japanese high cover spotted them immediately and dove to intercept, but they were starting from 23,000 feet, 1,000 feet below the P-40s, and energy advantage in a dive is everything. The Americans were faster. The Oscars, straining to catch them, fell behind. At 22,000 feet, Headman opened fire on the lead bomber from 500 yards, his .650 caliber Brownings hammering out 4,800 rounds per minute. The bomber's cockpit disintegrated. Glass, metal, and blood sprayed into the slipstream. The plane rolled left and fell out of formation, trailing smoke. The 5 other P-40s in Headman's flight followed in sequence, each firing a 2 to 3 second burst, each hitting a different bomber. One bomber lost its starboard engine, another had its tail section blown off. A third caught fire in the bomb bay and exploded, the shockwave rocking the planes around it. The formation scattered. The P-40s blew through at 430 miles per hour, dove another 3,000 feet, then pulled out hard and began climbing back toward the sun. The entire attack lasted 12 seconds. 3 bombers were falling. The Japanese escorts, diving to intercept, arrived 5 seconds too late. 30 seconds later, Prescott's second flight dove on the middle bomber formation. Same tactic, same precision. This time, the Japanese escorts were better positioned, diving in from the side to cut off the P-40s before they could extend. Prescott saw them coming, shouted a warning, and kept his dive angle steep, trusting speed to carry him through. His wingman, Fritz Wolf, fired a long burst into a bomber's fuel tanks, igniting a fireball that consumed 2 adjacent planes. But an Oscar, flown by a pilot with exceptional reflexes, managed to close to 200 yards and opened fire. Rounds stitched across Wolf's left wing, punching through the aileron and control cables. The P-40 shuddered, began to roll uncontrollably. Wolf fought the stick, managed to stabilize with opposite rudder, and dove away at full throttle, the Oscar unable to follow. He pulled out at 12,000 feet, alone, the wing damaged but functional, and headed for home. The third flight, led by Newkirk, held high at 24,000 feet, watching for threats. When the Japanese top cover tried to reposition and dive on the withdrawing second flight, Newkirk pounced. His 6 P-40s came in from above and behind, hitting the Oscars in their vulnerable 6 o'clock position. 2 Oscars went down in the first pass, one with its engine destroyed, the other with its pilot killed instantly. The rest scattered, breaking in all directions, their cohesion shattered. Newkirk's flight extended, climbed, and repositioned for another attack. For the next 18 minutes, the sky over Kunming became a 3-dimensional battlefield of diving P-40s, burning bombers, and frustrated Oscar pilots trying to protect a formation that no longer existed. The Japanese bombers, rattled and leaderless, jettisoned their payloads early and turned for home. Some dropped their bombs from 22,000 feet, too high for any chance of accuracy. Others held their loads until they crossed the border, dumping them in empty jungle. Not a single bomb hit Kunming, not a single civilian died. The final tally, confirmed by gun camera footage, wreckage analysis, and witness reports, was devastating. The Americans had destroyed 14 bombers and 4 fighters. Another 6 bombers and 3 fighters were listed as probables, damaged, and likely lost on the return flight. In exchange, the P-40s lost 2 planes, Wolf's damaged bird, which made it home but was scrapped for parts, and one flown by a pilot named Robert Moss, who took a 12.7-minute round through the oil cooler and crash-landed in a rice paddy 12 miles east of Kunming. Moss walked away with a sprained ankle, 18 P-40s against 70 Japanese aircraft, 14 confirmed kills, 6 probables, 2 planes lost, both pilots alive. It was the most lopsided air battle of the Pacific War to that point. Shimada landed in Hanoi at 1:30 p.m., his plane undamaged, but his pride shattered. His after-action report was terse and bitter. The American mercenaries cannot be defeated using conventional escort tactics. They have superior altitude performance, superior firepower, and superior discipline. They do not fight like fighter pilots. They fight like assassins. Recommend suspension of daylight bombing operations against Kunming until reinforcements arrive. Tokyo read the report in silence. The 64th Sentai, one of the elite units of the Imperial Army Air Force, had been beaten by a ragtag group of mercenaries flying obsolete planes. The humiliation was complete. Chenot walked the flight line that evening, inspecting the returning planes, talking quietly with each pilot, making notes in a battered leather journal. When Duke Hedman climbed out of his cockpit, exhausted and drenched in sweat, Chenot shook his hand and said, "You just proved that physics beats tradition every time." Hedman, too tired to smile, replied, "The napkin worked, sir." Chenot nodded. "Damn right it did." The victory at Kunming marked a turning point. Over the next 4 months, the first American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, flew 131 combat missions and claimed 296 enemy aircraft destroyed, with another 153 listed as probables. Official Japanese records, declassified after the war, confirmed 115 losses attributable to AVG action, still an extraordinary kill ratio. The P-40, dismissed by experts as obsolete, became the most feared American fighter in the China-Burma-India theater. And Chenot's energy tactics, sketched on a bar napkin and mocked by senior officers, became the foundation of American fighter doctrine for the rest of the war. The U.S. Army Air Forces analyzed his methods, codified them into training manuals, and taught them to every fighter pilot in the Pacific. The napkin itself survived the war. Chenot kept it in his desk drawer, folded carefully, stained with whiskey and ink. After the war, a reporter asked him if he regretted not being taken seriously by the Air Corps before Pearl Harbor. Chenot lit a lucky strike, exhaled slowly, and said, "They laughed at the napkin, but the napkin won the fight. That's all that matters." The kill ratio spoke for itself. In 7 months of combat, from December 1941 to July 1942, the Flying Tigers lost 12 P-40s in air-to-air combat. In exchange, they destroyed or damaged over 400 Japanese aircraft. That was a 33-to-1 exchange rate, the highest of any American fighter unit in World War II. The P-40s, slow and heavy by contemporary standards, had outfought the agile Japanese fighters because Chenot understood a fundamental truth that his peers had missed. In aerial combat, energy management beats maneuverability. Speed beats turning. Discipline beats aggression. And a doctrine written on a napkin, if it is grounded in physics and tested under fire, can defeat an empire. The Japanese never again attempted a daylight raid on Kunming in force. They switched to high-altitude strikes, night bombing, and eventually abandoned strategic bombing in southern China altogether. The Burma Road stayed open. American supplies continued to flow. And the myth of Japanese air superiority, carefully cultivated since 1937, was shattered over the skies of Yunnan province by a half-deaf retired captain and a squadron of misfits flying planes no one else wanted. Years later, when historians analyzed the Flying Tigers' success, they pointed to the advanced warning network, the rugged P-40 airframe, the exceptional pilot quality. All of that was true, but every pilot who flew with Chenot knew the real secret. It was not the planes, it was not the early warning, it was the napkin. It was the doctrine. It was the relentless, unyielding insistence that discipline and energy management could defeat superior numbers and superior maneuverability. Chenot had told them on day one, fight smart, not hard. Fight physics, not emotion. Fight the enemy's weaknesses, not his strengths. And when the world laughed at a napkin, he proved them all wrong with 14 burning bombers falling out of a clear January sky. The war would rage for 3 more years. The Flying Tigers would disband in July 1942, absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group. Many of the original pilots would return home. Some would die in later battles. But none of them ever forgot January 28, 1942, the day 18 P-40s took on 70 Japanese aircraft and won. The day the napkin doctrine became legend. The day physics beat pride. And the day Claire Lee Chenot, the washed-up has-been from Louisiana, proved that the best ideas sometimes come from the most unlikely places, like the back of a bar napkin, stained with whiskey and covered in cramped handwriting, held together by stubbornness and genius. The napkin disappeared sometime in 1943. Chennault never spoke about what happened to it. Some say he gave it to a pilot as a good luck charm. Others claim it was lost during a headquarters move from Kunming to Chongqing. One persistent rumor suggests he burned it himself, tired of reporters asking to see the famous sketch, tired of being known as the Napkin General instead of the tactician who had rewritten air combat doctrine. Whatever the truth, the napkin became a ghost, more myth than artifact, more symbol than object, but its absence did not diminish its legacy. By 1944, every American fighter pilot in the Pacific had been trained in energy tactics. Dive and extend, speed over maneuverability, altitude over aggression. The Chennault method had become Air Force orthodoxy, taught at flight schools in California, Texas, and Nevada, passed down from instructor to student, like sacred text. But recognition, when it finally came, was grudging and incomplete. In July 1942, the Flying Tigers were disbanded and absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces. Chennault, the retired captain who had been forced out in disgrace 5 years earlier, was offered a commission as a colonel. He accepted, though the rank stung. He had commanded a fighter group that had achieved the highest kill ratio in American history, had defended China's supply lines against impossible odds, and had humiliated the Japanese Air Force repeatedly. His peers, the men who had mocked him in 1937, were now generals. He was a colonel. The message was clear: your tactics worked, but you are still not one of us. Chennault swallowed the insult, put on the uniform, and kept fighting. The Army Air Forces promoted him to Brigadier General in 1943, then Major General in 1944, but always with hesitation, always with bureaucratic delay. His superiors in Washington never fully forgave him for being right when they had been wrong. They acknowledged his victories but downplayed his methods, crediting the P-40's ruggedness or the courage of individual pilots, anything except the doctrine. Official reports from the War Department described the Flying Tigers' success as the result of favorable conditions and pilot quality, carefully avoiding any mention of Chennault's unorthodox tactics. It was an institutional erasure, subtle but deliberate. The establishment could not stomach the idea that a washed-up has been with a hearing aid and a bar napkin had outsmarted them all. History, for a long time, followed their lead. After the war, the Flying Tigers became a footnote, overshadowed by the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign over Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen's fight against segregation, and the island-hopping campaigns that produced aces like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. Chennault retired in 1945, returned to Louisiana, and spent his final years writing memoirs and consulting for the Republic of China Air Force. He died in 1958, largely forgotten by the American public, remembered in China but invisible at home. His obituary in the New York Times was 4 paragraphs long. It did not mention the napkin. It barely mentioned Kunming, but the pilots remembered. The men who had flown with him, who had learned his tactics under fire, who had survived because they followed the rules he sketched in a Chongqing bar, they remembered. They gathered at reunions in San Antonio and San Diego, gray-haired and limping, swapping stories about shark-mouthed P-40s and diving attacks at 400 miles per hour. They spoke Chennault's name with reverence, like a prayer, and they told the story of the napkin to anyone who would listen, to sons and grandsons, to historians and documentary filmmakers, insisting that the world understand. This was not luck. This was not accident. This was genius, written in ink on paper, tested in blood and fire, and proven against an enemy that everyone else feared. Slowly, reluctantly, history began to correct itself. In the 1960s, declassified Japanese war records confirmed the Flying Tigers' kill claims, validating what veterans had been saying for years. In the 1970s, military historians began reanalyzing Chennault's tactics and realized they had anticipated jet-age combat by decades. Energy fighting, boom and zoom, mutual support, disciplined disengagement. These were the foundational principles of Korean War jet combat, Vietnam-era dogfighting, and modern air superiority doctrine. The F-86 Sabre pilots who fought over the Yalu River in 1951 were flying the Napkin. The F-4 Phantom crews over Hanoi in 1967 were flying the Napkin. Every fighter pilot who learned to manage energy instead of chasing maneuverability was flying the Napkin. Chennault had not just won a battle, he had rewritten the manual. In 1991, the Air Force inducted Chennault into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, 50 years too late. The ceremony was attended by 3 surviving flying tigers, all in their 80s, all wearing their old leather jackets with faded squadron patches. One of them, a former wingman named Charlie Bond, stood at the podium and told the story of January 28, 1942, when 18 P-40s faced 70 Japanese planes and won. He described the fear, the adrenaline, the impossible odds. And then he said, "We won because one man refused to accept what everyone told him was impossible. One man who got laughed at for drawing tactics on a napkin. One man who believed that physics beats tradition. If you remember nothing else about Claire Chennault, remember that. He taught us to think, not just fly. And that made all the difference." The lesson, if there is one, is uncomfortable for institutions to accept. It is the lesson that orthodoxy is often wrong, that the experts, the committees, the senior leadership with their decades of experience and shelves of credentials, they can be catastrophically mistaken. And that the most important breakthroughs often come from outsiders, from the rejected and the ridiculed, from the people who have nothing to lose and everything to prove. Chennault was not supposed to succeed. He was supposed to fail quietly in a Chinese backwater, another forgotten casualty of a war that had not yet touched America. Instead, he built a fighting force that became legendary, using ideas that the establishment had dismissed as lunacy. But here is the harder truth, the one that cuts deeper. Chennault's victory was not inevitable. If even one variable had been different, if the P-40 had been slightly slower, if the early warning network had failed, if his pilots had ignored his orders and dog-fought the Zeros, the Napkin doctrine would have died in the skies over Kunming, and Chennault would have been remembered as a crank who got good men killed with bad ideas. Victory validated him. Defeat would have erased him. That is the razor's edge that every maverick walks. The system forgives conventional failure, but never forgives unconventional failure. If you break the rules and lose, you are finished. If you break the rules and win, you are tolerated. And if you break the rules and win repeatedly, decisively, undeniably, then maybe the system rewrites the rules and pretends it was always on your side. The napkin is gone, but the question it asks remains. How many other napkins have been thrown away? How many other half-deaf captains with unorthodox ideas have been pushed out, dismissed, forgotten? How many wars could have been shortened? How many lives saved if institutions were better at recognizing genius before it was validated by survival? There is no good answer. Only the uncomfortable awareness that progress is often accidental, that breakthroughs depend on stubborn individuals who refuse to quit even when the world tells them they are wrong. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you will find a restored P-40E Warhawk, painted in flying tiger's colors, shark mouth grinning, tail number 68. It sits under bright lights in the World War II gallery, surrounded by plaques describing Chennault's tactics and the AVG's kill ratio. Tourists take photos. Children press their faces against the glass. But there is no napkin, no artifact, no scrap of paper, no physical proof that the legend is real. Just stories, just testimony, just the insistence of old men that it happened, that it mattered, that it changed everything. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the napkin does not need to exist anymore because it has been absorbed into the culture, into the training manuals and the fighter pilot traditions, into the very language of air combat. When an instructor at Nellis Air Force Base tells a young F-22 pilot to fight vertical, not horizontal, he is teaching the napkin. When a squadron commander briefs his pilots to never turn with a bandit, he is teaching the napkin. When a flight leader emphasizes mutual support and disciplined disengagement, he is teaching the napkin. Chennault's doctrine is so deeply embedded in modern air combat that it no longer feels like a doctrine. It feels like common sense. And that perhaps is the ultimate victory. when your radical idea becomes so obviously correct that people forget it was ever radical. But we should not forget. We should remember the Chongqing Officers' Club, the cigarette smoke and whiskey glasses, the half-deaf captain drawing diagrams on a napkin while senior officers laughed. We should remember the pilots who trusted him, who flew his tactics, who survived because they followed rules that seemed insane. We should remember Duke Hedman at 24,000 feet, rolling inverted, committing to a dive against 70 enemy aircraft because a retired captain with a hearing aid told him it would work. We should remember the 14 bombers falling from the sky, the vindication, the physics triumphing over pride. And we should ask ourselves, who is being laughed at today? What napkin is being thrown away right now in some conference room or officers' club or startup garage because the idea sounds crazy and the person proposing it does not have the right credentials or the right rank or the right reputation? What breakthrough are we missing because we are too invested in orthodoxy, too comfortable with tradition, too afraid of looking foolish by backing an outsider? Chanot is gone. The flying tigers are nearly gone. Soon, there will be no one left who flew with him, no one who saw the napkin, no one who can testify that it really happened. But the story endures, and the lesson endures. Do not dismiss the mavericks. Do not ignore the outsiders. Do not laugh at the napkin, because sometimes, just sometimes, the crazy idea scribbled on a bar napkin in a backwater officers' club is the idea that changes the world. Sometimes the washed-up has-been with nothing to lose is the only person brave enough, or desperate enough, or stubborn enough to see what everyone else missed. And sometimes physics really does beat pride. If you are a pilot, remember Chanot when doctrine fails and instinct says dive. If you are a leader, remember him when a subordinate proposes something unconventional and your first instinct is to dismiss it. If you are an outsider, remember him when the experts laugh and tell you it cannot be done. The napkin worked. The napkin won. And somewhere in a Louisiana graveyard, under a granite headstone that reads Claire Lee Chennault, Major General, United States Air Force, the old fighter pilot is smiling because he knew all along that the best revenge is not anger, it is victory. Tell the story. Pass it down. When the last flying tiger is gone, and the P-40s are nothing but museum pieces and fading photographs, remember that 70 years ago, a half-deaf maverick with a bar napkin taught the world that genius does not require permission. It only requires courage, discipline, and an unshakable belief that physics beats everything, even an empire, even history, even the men who laughed. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Every like tells the algorithm that real stories of forgotten genius matter more than shallow viral content. Subscribe because we're bringing you a forgotten hero every single week. The mavericks who rewrote the rules, the outsiders who proved the experts wrong, the napkins that changed history. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from San Diego to Singapore. From retired fighter pilots to engineering students, from history teachers to aerospace mechanics, you're not just a number on a screen. You're part of preserving the legacy of men like Claire Chennault, Duke Hedman, and every flying tiger who proved that discipline beats tradition and physics beats pride. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure that a bar napkin and the men who believed in it don't fade into silence. Chanot was laughed at, pushed out, and forgotten by his own institution. But he was right, and you're helping ensure that his story, and every underdog story like it, gets remembered. Because the world needs to know, sometimes the best ideas come from the most unlikely places. Hit that subscribe button. The next story drops in 7 days.